Long before empires and borders, there were the Celts, shaped by forests, rivers, hills, and memory rather than crowns or capitals. This documentary tells their full story, from prehistoric roots and warrior cultures to their clash with Rome and a legacy that never disappeared. Before we begin, like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The edge of the ancient world, where the Celts first emerged. The Celts did not emerge at the centre of the ancient world, where warm plains encouraged predictable agriculture and stone cities anchored power for centuries. They emerged far from that certainty, in lands shaped by forests that seemed endless, rivers that carved deep paths through hills, and seasons that demanded constant adjustment. This was Iron Age Europe, a world without natural borders, without guaranteed harvests, and without the kind of geography that rewarded rigid control. From this demanding environment, the Celtic world slowly took shape, not as a single people or empire, but as a way of living that matched the land itself. Long before the word Celt existed, communities were already spread across Central Europe, living in small clusters tied closely to soil, water, and weather. These people did not build their lives around cities. They built them around movement. Fields were cleared from forests through immense labour, only to be abandoned generations later when soil weakened or pressure increased. Rivers became paths rather than borders, connecting distant valleys without unifying them. The Danube, the Rhine, and countless tributaries carried people, tools, animals, and stories across wide regions, binding communities together loosely without erasing difference. The environment dictated limits that could not be ignored. Dense forests restricted visibility and slowed travel. Hills and mountains fragmented the land, isolating valleys and encouraging local identity. Winters were long and unpredictable, capable of killing livestock and people alike. Summers could bring abundance or ruin depending on rain and temperature. Agriculture was possible, but fragile. Unlike river civilizations to the south, irrigation here did not guarantee surplus. Survival required flexibility rather than mastery. Because the land resisted central control, power could not easily concentrate. No single ruler could oversee wide territories separated by forests and hills. No city could dominate surrounding land without constant force. Communities remained relatively small, their leadership local, their loyalties personal. This was not underdevelopment, it was adaptation. The land rewarded independence and punished overreach. Archaeology first reveals a recognisable Celtic pattern in highland regions associated with what is now called the Hallstatt culture. These were not capitals or states, but zones defined by resources rather than borders. One resource mattered above all others: salt. Salt preserved meat through long winters and allowed food to be stored beyond a single season. Control of salt deposits and trade routes brought wealth and influence without requiring cities or empires. Communities that controlled these routes prospered, attracting craftsmen, traders, and warriors. From these regions, cultural traits spread gradually. Burial customs shifted, weapons took on shared forms. Artistic styles began to echo one another across wide areas. This spread did not happen through conquest. There is little evidence of mass invasions sweeping culture across Europe. Instead, movement was constant and personal. People migrated for marriage, pasture, safety, and opportunity. Warriors travelled to serve distant leaders. Traders carried goods and ideas. Over generations, a shared cultural language emerged without erasing local identity. This is essential to understanding the Celts. They were never one people in the way later societies imagined nations. They did not see themselves as Celts. They identified by tribe, by clan, by valley, by river. Identity was intimate, and local. Loyalty was earned and renewed. Authority existed only as long as it was recognized by those who followed. Forests reinforced this fragmentation. To Mediterranean observers, forests appeared as empty wilderness. To those who lived within them, forests were inhabited landscapes, sources of timber, fuel, game, and protection. They also limited movement and visibility. Large formations were difficult to maintain. Roads were slow to build and easy to lose. Ambush favoured those who knew the land. Forests reduced the advantage of numbers and rewarded familiarity. This environment shaped conflict. Warfare existed, but it was not imperial. Raids mattered more than conquest. Battles were often seasonal, tied to agricultural cycles. Victory was measured in cattle taken, honour gained, and alliances strengthened, not in territory permanently occupied. Defeat did not erase a people. Communities could retreat, regroup, and return. Iron changed daily life profoundly. Unlike bronze, which depended on distant trade for tin, iron could be sourced locally in many parts of Europe. This made tools and weapons more accessible. Farming implements improved. Clearing forests became easier. Weapons became more common. But iron did not produce centralized power. Instead, it distributed power more widely. More individuals could arm themselves. Authority became harder to monopolize. Settlements reflected this reality. Instead of cities, people built hillforts, elevated enclosures surrounded by earthworks, timber palisades, and ditches. These were not urban centres in the Mediterranean sense. They were refuges, storehouses, meeting places, and symbols of territory. Many were lightly occupied in times of peace. In times of danger, entire communities gathered behind their defences. Hill forts anchored identity without demanding permanent population density. Life unfolded between these places. People lived in scattered farmsteads, moving seasonally with herds, tending fields when weather allowed, gathering in fortified spaces during conflict or ritual. This rhythm produced resilience. Communities could disperse under pressure and reform when conditions improved. There was no single point whose fall meant collapse. Religion grew directly from this relationship with land. Sacred places were not monumental temples, but groves, springs, rivers, stones, and hilltops. The divine was encountered in mist rising from water, in ancient trees, in places where the boundary between worlds felt thin. Gods were not distant lawmakers. They were forces embedded in landscape, to be respected, feared, and negotiated with. This worldview shaped leadership. Authority was never absolute. Leaders emerged through reputation, bravery, generosity, lineage, and success. Chieftains were expected to give feasts, distribute wealth, and protect followers. Their power depended on constant affirmation. A leader who failed could be abandoned. Loyalty was voluntary and conditional. Memory carried culture. Without writing, history lived in story, song, and genealogy. Laws were remembered and recited. Identity survived through repetition rather than record. This made culture adaptable but fluid. The past could be reshaped to meet present needs. Continuity mattered more than precision. Generations passed. What we now recognise as Celtic culture spread westward into broader lands, northward toward colder coasts, and southward into mountain foothills. This expansion followed rivers, ridges, and opportunity rather than plan. It was uneven, shaped by terrain rather than ambition. By the time Mediterranean writers noticed these peoples, they were already widespread, yet nowhere centralised. To outsiders, this world appeared chaotic. There were no capitals to conquer, no kings whose defeat ended resistance, no written laws to impose order. But this was not disorder. It was a system adapted perfectly to its environment, one that valued flexibility over permanence, memory over monument, and land over abstract authority. The edge of the ancient world was not empty. It was alive with motion, memory, and resilience. Iron Age Europe shaped a people who did not build empires because their land did not reward empire. They built something else instead, a way of life capable of enduring pressure without breaking, absorbing change without losing identity. This was the world from which the Celts emerged, and as that way of life took root, it deepened rather than unified. Across Iron Age Europe, the land continued to teach the same lesson generation after generation. Survival belonged to those who adapted locally. Knowledge of place became the most valuable inheritance. People learned which soils tired quickly and which recovered, which slopes shed water and which held it, which forests hid game even in winter, and which rivers could be crossed safely when swollen by rain. This knowledge was not written. It lived in habit, story, and shared memory, passed quietly from elders to children through work rather than instruction. To know the land was to belong to it. Movement never ceased, but it was never random. When soil weakened, families shifted fields or moved entirely. When conflict intensified, communities dispersed and later reassembled. When opportunity appeared along a river bend or salt route, groups followed it. These movements carried language, customs, and belief across wide regions without dissolving local identity. Celtic culture spread like a network of paths rather than a single road. Trade strengthened those paths. Rivers remained the arteries of exchange, carrying amber from the north, salt from the uplands, iron from hidden veins, livestock from open pasture. Traders followed familiar routes, stopping at hillforts that served as safe nodes rather than markets ruled by law. Goods moved alongside news, marriages, and alliances. Wealth accumulated unevenly, but it rarely translated into lasting dominance. Where influence grew too heavy, resistance followed. Balance returned through fragmentation rather than collapse. This constant negotiation shaped social life. Status existed, but it was unstable. Leaders rose through generosity and success, not decree. Feasts mattered because they redistributed wealth and reaffirmed loyalty. A chieftain who hoarded lost followers. A warrior who failed lost reputation. Authority was renewed continually or it dissolved. As Celtic culture spread westward into broader plains, differences emerged without breaking continuity. In parts of Gaul, where land opened and populations grew, hillforts became larger and more complex. Exchange intensified. Elites displayed wealth more openly. Yet even here, no permanent centre formed. Power remained conditional, alliances temporary, identity local. Along the Atlantic fringe, conditions were harsher and more isolating. Coastal winds and rocky soils shaped smaller communities bound tightly to place. Here, memory mattered more than exchange. Myth deepened. Sacred landscapes multiplied. Identity fused with coastline, river mouth, and hill. These regions would later preserve Celtic languages and traditions longest, precisely because distance and terrain slowed outside control. Everywhere, belief remained rooted in environment. Rivers were not merely watercourses, they were living presences. Springs healed, groves watched, stones remembered. Ritual did not separate people from land, it bound them to it. Sacred places required care, not conquest. This outlook made the idea of absolute ownership foreign. Land was held through relationship, not title. Warfare reflected these values. Conflict existed, but it rarely aimed at annihilation. Raids tested strength and resolved disputes. Victories brought prestige and cattle, not permanent occupation. Defeat did not erase identity. Communities retreated, regrouped, and endured. Even when hillforts fell, people remained. Iron continued to shape life without reshaping society into empire. Tools improved, forests thinned, fields expanded, but authority stayed dispersed. The accessibility of iron ensured that no small group could monopolize force for long. Defense was communal, resistance was local. This decentralized strength baffled outsiders. When Mediterranean traders and explorers encountered the Celtic world, they searched for familiar markers, capitals, kings, laws, archives. They found none that fit expectation. What they saw instead was movement, negotiation, and memory. To them, this looked like disorder. In reality, it was order tuned to terrain. As contact increased, selective adoption followed. Luxury goods arrived and were admired. Artistic styles blended and evolved, giving rise to flowing forms and intricate patterns that echoed movement rather than symmetry. Coinage appeared in some regions, used when useful and ignored when not. Writing was observed but rarely embraced. Oral tradition remained more efficient where authority was personal and life mobile. This selectivity preserved autonomy. Dependence did not take hold. Influence flowed both ways without erasing difference. Over time, Celtic communities reached the edges of the known world, to mountain passes, ocean coasts, and island chains. Each place reshaped culture without breaking it. Language shifted subtly, customs adapted, belief localized, the thread held. When pressure mounted, through climate variability, population movement, or the advance of organized states, Celtic societies responded as they always had. Some merged, some migrated, some resisted, some adapted. There was no single defeat that ended everything, because there was no single authority to defeat. This is why the edge endured. Where centralized societies depended on permanence, the Celtic world depended on continuity. Where empires sought control, Celtic communities sought balance. Where cities anchored power, landscapes anchored identity. Understanding the Celts begins here, in forests that limited sight and rewarded knowledge, in rivers that connected without unifying, in hills that sheltered communities without enclosing them. It begins with people who learned that survival did not require domination, that order did not require uniformity, and that memory could replace monument. This ancient world had many centres and many answers to survival. The Celtic answer emerged at its edge, shaped by land that resisted command and rewarded adaptation. From that edge came a people who proved that civilization could exist without cities, authority without empire, and endurance without conquest. This was where the Celts first emerged. Before history spoke their name, early Celtic cultures. Long before the Celts were named, before any outsider attempted to describe them, their cultures were already old. This was a world without written history, where identity did not depend on records or monuments, but on continuity, on practices repeated until they became tradition. To understand the Celts, one must first enter this deep prehistoric space where culture existed without labels and memory mattered more than chronology. Across Central Europe in the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, communities lived in landscapes that demanded constant adaptation. Forests pressed close to settlements. Hills and valleys fragmented movement. Rivers offered connection, but also danger. These people were not waiting for civilization to arrive. They were already solving the problems of survival in ways suited to their environment. Over time, shared solutions became shared culture. Archaeology gives us the first clear outline of early Celtic society through what is known as the Hallstatt horizon, named after the region of Hallstatt in the Eastern Alps. This area was not important because it was a capital or centre of power, but because it sat atop vast salt deposits. In a prehistoric world, salt was life. It preserved meat through winter, stabilised food supply, and enabled storage beyond a single season. Control of salt created stability, and stability allowed culture to deepen. Communities connected to Hallstatt did not form a state, they formed a network. Salt moved outward along river roads and mountain paths, and with it moved people, ideas and objects. Burial customs, weapon styles, and decorative motifs began to appear across wide regions. This spread was gradual and organic. There is no evidence of mass invasion or forced assimilation. Culture travelled through contact, marriage, trade, and imitation. Elite burials from this period reveal how status worked in early Celtic societies. Some graves were richly furnished with weapons, ornaments, tools, and imported goods from distant lands. These objects were not symbols of bureaucratic office or inherited rank alone. They reflected reputation. Leadership was personal and visible. Wealth was meant to be displayed, shared, and remembered. Death itself reveals worldview. The dead were buried with items needed beyond life, suggesting continuity rather than finality. This belief shaped attitudes toward risk, courage, and honour. A life was meaningful not because it ended safely, but because it was remembered well. This perspective would later define Celtic warrior culture, but its roots lie here, in prehistoric belief. Metalworking advanced steadily during this period. Bronze remained important, but iron began to dominate. Iron tools improved agriculture, allowing deeper ploughing and more effective forest clearing. Iron weapons increased the potential for violence, but they did not produce standing armies or centralized power. Instead, iron spread capability more evenly. Authority remained dispersed, rooted in personal bonds rather than institutions. Settlements reflected this decentralization. People lived in farmsteads and small villages rather than cities. Early fortified sites existed, but they were refugees rather than permanent urban centres. Life remained mobile. People moved with seasons, herds, and opportunity. This mobility prevented rigid hierarchy from forming. Trade expanded without dependence. Hallstatt-era communities exchanged goods with the Mediterranean world. Wine vessels, luxury items, and exotic materials appear in graves far from their origin. Yet these goods did not replace local customs. They were absorbed selectively, used to reinforce local identity rather than erase it. Religion during this prehistoric phase was inseparable from landscape. Sacred places were natural: springs, caves, groves, hilltops. Ritual was embedded in daily life, not confined to temples. The divine was encountered in environment, not centralized in priesthoods. This belief system encouraged respect for land rather than domination of it. Leadership followed the same pattern. Power was situational. A leader proved worth through protection, generosity, and success. Authority faded when it failed. There were no permanent offices enforced by law. This fluid system matched a world where survival depended on constant adjustment. Language spread slowly and unevenly. Without writing, speech adapted regionally. Dialects diverged but remained related. Oral tradition carried law, history, and belief. Memory was flexible, allowing the past to be reshaped to meet present needs. By the end of the Hallstatt period, the foundations of Celtic culture were firmly in place. No one called it Celtic yet. There was no single identity or unified people, but the patterns were there: land-based belief, personal authority, selective exchange, and continuity through memory. This was the world before history spoke their name, a prehistoric network of communities already old, already resilient, already prepared to endure change without losing themselves. The foundations laid during the Hallstatt period did not harden into a fixed form. They remained alive, capable of transformation. As centuries passed and pressures shifted, population growth, climate variation, intensified trade, and increased contact with distant worlds, Early Celtic culture entered a new prehistoric phase of expression without abandoning its roots. This transition did not feel like a break to the people living through it. There was no sense of an age ending and another beginning. Instead, change arrived gradually, carried by objects, stories, and movement. Burial customs evolved. Art became more fluid. Weapons and ornaments began to express something beyond function or status. What archaeologists later called the Latin tradition emerged not as a revolution, but as a flowering. The shift is visible first in art. Earlier, geometric forms softened into curves, spirals, and flowing lines. Animal figures twisted into abstract shapes. Human faces appeared rarely, stylized and incomplete. This was not decoration for its own sake. The art reflected worldview. Motion replaced symmetry. Transformation replaced permanence. Life was understood as a process, not a state. This artistic language spread across wide regions of Europe, appearing on weapons, jewellery, shields, and everyday objects. No central authority dictated style. No single workshop controlled production. Instead, artisans adapted shared motifs to local tastes. The result was unity without uniformity, recognisably related forms that still expressed regional identity. Warfare during this period intensified, but it remained personal rather than imperial. Iron weapons became more refined, swords lengthened, shields grew more elaborate. Combat emphasised individual skill and bravery. Reputation mattered more than territory. Warriors sought honour, not annihilation. Victory was remembered in story, not recorded in stone. This focus on personal valour reinforced social structure. Leaders remained first among equals rather than distant rulers. They led in battle, hosted feasts, and redistributed wealth. A leader who failed lost followers. Authority was constantly tested and renewed. This instability prevented rigid hierarchy from forming, even as societies grew more complex. Hillforts expanded in size and significance during this later prehistoric phase. Some became major regional centres, controlling trade routes and serving as gathering places for ritual, negotiation, and defence. Yet even the largest hill forts never became cities in the Mediterranean sense. They lacked permanent dense populations, monumental stone architecture, and bureaucratic administration. They were places of convergence, not control. Trade networks expanded dramatically. Celtic communities now sat at the crossroads between the Mediterranean world and northern Europe. Wine, glass, and luxury goods flowed north. Amber, slaves, metals, and crafted objects flowed south. These exchanges brought wealth and exposure, but they did not dissolve cultural boundaries. Adoption remained selective. Influence was filtered through existing values. This selectivity extended to technology and ideas. Coinage appeared in some regions, modelled on Greek examples, but it was used inconsistently. Writing was known, but rarely adopted. Oral tradition continued to serve social needs more effectively. In societies where authority was personal and memory communal, writing offered little advantage. Religion continued to evolve without centralization. Sacred spaces multiplied, but they remained tied to landscape rather than buildings. Offerings were placed in rivers, bogs, groves, and springs. Weapons were deliberately bent or broken before deposition, signalling ritual removal from the human world. These acts suggest belief in a boundary between realms, a transition, rather than an ending. The role of ritual specialists deepened. While later writers would call them druids, their prehistoric origins lie here, in communities that required memory keepers, judges, healers, and intermediaries between worlds. Knowledge was power, but it was not hoarded. It was preserved through training, repetition, and secrecy. Language continued to spread and diversify. Dialects branched and overlapped. Communication remained possible across regions, but identity stayed local. There was no single Celtic tongue, just related ways of speaking shaped by movement and isolation. Language reinforced belonging without creating unity. As Celtic culture expanded westward and northward, it encountered new environments, coastal zones, islands, marshlands. Each required adaptation. Farming methods shifted, diets changed, settlement patterns adjusted, yet core values endured: flexibility, local authority, respect for land, and continuity through memory. By the late prehistoric period, Celtic societies covered vast portions of Europe. They were visible to outsiders now, not as a single people, but as many related ones. Greek writers began to describe them, often inaccurately, projecting fear and fascination onto cultures they did not understand. The Celts entered written history already misinterpreted. What outsiders saw as chaos was in truth resilience. What they saw as lack of order was balance. Celtic societies did not aim to control the world, they aimed to live within it. This long prehistoric development explains why later encounters with empire unfolded as they did. When centralized states pushed north, they faced societies that could not be conquered cleanly. There was no capital to seize, no single authority to overthrow, no written law to replace. Resistance was local, persistent, and adaptive. Before history spoke their name, the Celts had already solved the problem of survival in difficult lands. They had learned how to build identity without monuments, authority without bureaucracy, and continuity without writing. These solutions would shape every later chapter of their story. The Celts did not suddenly appear in history. History stumbled upon them late. By the time their name was written, their culture was already ancient, hardened by centuries of adaptation, flexible enough to endure pressure, and rooted deeply enough in land and memory to survive long after political independence faded. This was the world before history spoke their name. Tribes without kings. How Celtic society was organised. The Celtic world was not built around kings seated on thrones, ruling from capitals that commanded obedience through law and distance. It was built around people who knew one another, who shared ancestry, land, obligation, and memory. Authority did not descend from a crown. It emerged from relationships. To understand how Celtic society functioned, one must let go of the idea that order requires a king and recognise that for the Celts, stability came from balance rather than command. At the foundation of Celtic society stood the clan. A clan was more than family, but less than a state. It was a network of related households bound by blood, marriage, and mutual responsibility. Identity began here. A person was not defined by allegiance to a ruler, but by belonging to a lineage. Protection, support, and justice flowed first through kinship before any broader structure existed. Clans occupied territory collectively. Land was not owned by individuals in the modern sense, nor was it controlled by distant authority. Rights to farm, graze, hunt, and settle were negotiated within the group and passed down through generations. This created a deep attachment to place. Land was memory made visible, shaped by ancestors and owed to descendants. Above the clan stood the tribe, a looser association of related clans who shared language, customs, and territory. Tribes were not rigid political units. They expanded, contracted, merged, and fractured depending on circumstance. Loyalty to the tribe mattered most during conflict, ritual, and negotiation with outsiders. In daily life, the clan remained primary. Tribal identity was reinforced through shared myth and ancestry. Genealogies were remembered and recited, linking living members to legendary founders and heroic pasts. These stories were not entertainment alone. They were legal memory. They explained rights, obligations, and status, To forget lineage was to lose one's place in the world. Leadership within this system did not resemble kingship. Chieftains were not rulers by divine right. They were leaders by recognition. A chieftain emerged through a combination of lineage, reputation, generosity, and success. Birth mattered, but it was never enough on its own. Authority had to be earned and continually reinforced. A chieftain's power rested on followers, not institutions. Warriors chose whom to follow. Families aligned themselves with leaders who could protect them, provide food in times of scarcity, and distribute wealth gained through trade or war. Loyalty was conditional. A chieftain who failed could be abandoned without revolution or succession crisis. Power dissolved quietly. Generosity was the core of leadership. Wealth was not hoarded, it was displayed and redistributed. Feasting played a central role in social order. By hosting feasts, a chieftain reaffirmed bonds, rewarded loyalty, and demonstrated capability. A leader who could not give was not worth following. Warriors formed the visible edge of this hierarchy, but they did not dominate it. Warrior status was earned through bravery and reputation, not inherited rank alone. Combat emphasized personal valor. Deeds were remembered in story and song. Fame mattered because it translated into influence, marriage prospects, and followers. Yet Celtic society was not purely martial. Farmers, herders, craftsmen, and traders formed its backbone. Social hierarchy existed, but it was fluid. A successful farmer with strong kinship ties could wield more influence than a poorly regarded warrior. Status shifted with circumstance. Law existed without codification. Disputes were settled through customary practice, mediation, and compensation rather than punishment imposed by a state. Wrongdoing created imbalance, not crime against abstract authority. Resolution aimed to restore harmony between groups rather than assert dominance. Those who held knowledge held power of a different kind. Judges, poets, and ritual specialists preserved law, history, and belief through memory. Their authority came from expertise rather than force. They advised leaders, settled disputes, and maintained continuity across generations. This balance prevented tyranny but limited scale. Celtic society could organise effectively at local and tribal levels, but it resisted centralisation. There were no permanent offices that outlived individuals. No bureaucracy existed to enforce rule across distance. This made the system resilient locally, but fragmented regionally. From the outside, this looked like weakness. To the Celts, it was protection. No single defeat could destroy the whole. No assassination could collapse society. Authority was too distributed to be seized easily. This is why Celtic society functioned without kings. Order did not descend from above. It emerged from below, woven through kinship, reputation, obligation, and memory. That balance between authority and freedom shaped every layer of Celtic society, creating a hierarchy that existed without hard edges and roles that overlapped rather than separated cleanly. Below the chieftain and his warrior companions stood the wider body of free people, farmers, herders, craftsmen, traders, whose labour sustained the clan and tribe. These individuals were not powerless subjects. They held rights rooted in custom and kinship. Land use, protection, and compensation were negotiated through relationships rather than decrees. A free person wronged was not appealing to a king's court, but to memory, precedent, and the weight of communal expectation. Justice operated through restoration, not punishment. When harm occurred, the goal was balance. Compensation, often in livestock, goods, or service, was calculated according to the status of those involved and the nature of the offence. Violence created obligation. Bloodshed demanded resolution, not incarceration. This system discouraged cycles of revenge by providing a recognised path back to stability. It also required skilled mediation. Here, the knowledge keepers became essential. Poets, judges, and ritual specialists, later remembered under the broad name of druids, formed a class defined not by wealth or weapons, but by memory. They carried lore, genealogy, ritual, and history in their minds. Years of training were required. Knowledge was guarded, transmitted orally, and respected deeply. These figures did not rule, but they shaped decisions. A chieftain who ignored them risked losing legitimacy. Their influence reveals something fundamental about Celtic organisation. Power was not singular. It was layered. Force mattered, but so did wisdom. Wealth mattered, but so did reputation. Memory mattered most of all, because it bound the living to the past and gave weight to custom. Social hierarchy existed, but it was fluid. Rank could rise or fall within a lifetime. A warrior gained status through courage. A family gained standing through alliances. A leader lost authority through failure. Even bondage, where it existed, was not always permanent. Debt, captivity, or misfortune could reduce status, but redemption remained possible through service or compensation. Women occupied a position that confused later observers. They were not universally equal, but neither were they confined entirely to domestic roles. Women could own property, negotiate marriages, and in some regions act as leaders or ritual figures. Their status depended on lineage, wealth, and reputation rather than a fixed legal barrier. Marriage itself was a contract between families, designed to create alliances rather than enforce subordination. Children were raised into responsibility early. Identity was taught through participation, working land, tending animals, listening to stories, observing ritual. Education was lived, not formal. Knowledge passed through experience and repetition, embedding social order deeply into daily life. Feasting remained central to cohesion. These gatherings were not indulgence alone. They were political theatre, economic redistribution, and social reaffirmation. A feast demonstrated a leader's ability to provide, rewarded loyalty, resolved tensions, and created obligation. Seating order, gift exchange, and storytelling reinforced hierarchy without fixing it permanently. War, when it came, tested this system. Warriors followed leaders they trusted. Loyalty was proven in battle, not sworn eternally. After conflict, the structure loosened again. There was no standing army, no permanent command. This made large-scale campaigns difficult, but ensured that warfare did not consume society entirely. This organisation allowed Celtic societies to endure stress without collapsing. When a chieftain died, the system did not freeze. When a tribe fractured, clans persisted. When territory was lost, identity remained. Authority was portable because it lived in relationships rather than institutions. Yet this same structure imposed limits. Celtic societies could not easily unite under a single command for long. Alliances were temporary. Coordination beyond local or tribal levels was fragile. In moments of extreme external pressure, this fragmentation became dangerous. A system designed for balance struggled against centralized, bureaucratic states that could sustain long campaigns and impose uniform control. But before those pressures arrived, the system worked because it matched the world it inhabited. Forests, hills, and rivers discouraged centralization. Kinship networks thrived where administration could not. Oral law adapted faster than written codes. Authority grounded in reputation responded more quickly than distant rule. To the Celts, kingship as later civilizations understood it was unnecessary and risky. Absolute power threatened balance. Permanence threatened flexibility. The tribe without kings was not a primitive stage awaiting improvement. It was a deliberate arrangement shaped by environment, belief, and experience. This is why Celtic society appears contradictory in later accounts, fiercely hierarchical, yet resistant to domination, deeply traditional, yet adaptable, ordered without being centralized. These contradictions are only contradictions if one expects civilization to look the same everywhere. The Celts organized their world around people, not palaces, memory, not monuments, balance, not command. Their society endured not because it was rigid, but because it could bend without breaking. And in a landscape that rewarded resilience over control, that ability mattered more than any crown ever could. This was how Celtic society functioned: tribes without kings, held together by kinship, reputation, and shared memory, strong enough to endure the edge of the ancient world long before history tried to name them. Warriors of iron and myth. War in the Celtic world was never simply a matter of survival or expansion. It was a language through which identity was spoken, reputation was forged, and memory was preserved. To fight was not only to defend land or seize wealth, but to prove oneself worthy of remembrance. In a society without written history, the battlefield became one of the primary places where a life could gain meaning. Iron reshaped this world, but it did not reshape it into empire. When iron became common across Celtic lands, it transformed who could fight and how. Unlike bronze, which depended on distant trade networks and favoured elites, iron could be sourced locally and worked by skilled smiths within communities. This widened access to weapons. Warfare was no longer confined to a narrow aristocracy. Many free men could arm themselves, defend their kin, and seek honour through combat. Power became more widely distributed, not centralised. The sword stood at the centre of Celtic warrior identity. Long, iron, and carefully balanced, it was designed for close personal combat. These swords were not mass-produced. Each bore the individuality of its maker and owner. Decoration mattered. Balance mattered. A sword was an extension of the warrior's body and reputation. Losing one was a deep humiliation. Offering one ritually, by bending or breaking it before placing it in water or earth, was a powerful act, removing the weapon from human use and dedicating it to the other world. Spears were even more common than swords. They required less iron and less skill to produce, making them accessible and effective. In battle, spears dominated the opening moments, thrown to disrupt, thrust to keep distance, and used in numbers that overwhelmed opponents. Spears blurred the line between hunting and warfare, reflecting a culture where survival skills translated naturally into combat. Shields were essential, typically made of wood and leather, sometimes reinforced with metal. They were not passive defences. Shields were active tools, used to strike, shove, hook, and control space. Their designs varied by region and individual, often serving as markers of identity. To stand shield to shield was to enter a space of intense closeness where strength, balance, and nerve mattered more than formation. Armour was rare. Most Celtic warriors fought with minimal protection, perhaps a helmet, perhaps nothing more than layered clothing. This was not ignorance of danger, it was a cultural choice shaped by belief and practicality. Mobility mattered, confidence mattered. To fight exposed, demonstrated courage and invited reputation. Fearlessness itself became a weapon, unsettling opponents before blades even met. The battlefield was not silent. Celtic warfare was loud by design. Warriors shouted, sang, and taunted as they advanced. Hair was worn long or styled dramatically. Bodies might be painted or adorned. Sound played a crucial role. War trumpets like the carnix, long bronze instruments shaped like animal heads, produced harsh, unnatural noises meant to intimidate enemies and energize allies. Battle began in the mind long before it began in flesh. Combat favoured movement over formation. Celtic warriors did not typically fight in rigid ranks like later Roman legions. They advanced and withdrew fluidly, seeking openings, challenging individuals, and exploiting terrain. Leadership was visible. Chieftains fought among their followers, not behind them. Their courage directly affected morale. A brave leader could inspire extraordinary effort. A faltering one could unravel an entire force. This style made Celtic warriors terrifying in sudden encounters. Raids, ambushes, and short engagements played to their strengths. Speed, aggression, and initiative often overwhelmed opponents unprepared for such intensity. But this same approach struggled against prolonged, disciplined campaigns. Endurance favoured centralised states with supply lines, reserves, and rigid command. Celtic warfare excelled in moments, not months. War followed the seasons. Agricultural life imposed limits. Fields needed tending. Herds needed guarding. Prolonged campaigns threatened survival at home. As a result, warfare was intense but episodic. This prevented total war, but it also prevented permanent domination. Victory was measured in reputation, cattle, captives, and alliances rather than territory held indefinitely. Raiding was central. A successful raid brought wealth and prestige. It rewarded followers, strengthened bonds, and demonstrated leadership. Failure weakened authority quickly. Warfare redistributed resources and reaffirmed social ties. It was as much economic and social as it was violent. Myth infused every aspect of conflict. Warriors believed their deeds echoed beyond death. Stories preserved bravery and failure alike. A glorious death was not an ending, but a transformation into memory. This belief reduced fear and encouraged risk-taking. Courage mattered more than caution because reputation outlived the body. Ritual surrounded warfare. Weapons were blessed. Omens were read. Victories were dedicated to unseen powers. Defeated enemies' arms were sometimes displayed or deliberately destroyed, not merely as trophies, but as acts of spiritual significance. Rivers, bogs, and lakes received offerings meant to cross boundaries between worlds. Training was constant but informal. Young men learned through hunting, mock combat, and participation in raids. Skill came from experience, not drills. Strength, speed, and adaptability mattered more than uniformity. Individual excellence was prized, but always within the context of group loyalty. To outsiders, this appeared chaotic. Greek and Roman writers often described Celtic warriors as undisciplined or reckless. They misunderstood what they saw. Celtic warfare was not designed to hold territory or enforce long-term control. It was designed to assert autonomy, defend kin, and preserve balance. Yet even as this system revealed its limits against empire, it left a lasting impression. Opponents adapted tactics in response to Celtic ferocity. Legends grew because they were rooted in reality. The image of the fearless warrior charging into danger endured because it reflected a genuine cultural ideal. Warriors of iron and myth did not fight for empire. They fought to be remembered. That desire to be remembered shaped not only how Celtic warriors fought, but how they understood fear, defeat, and meaning on the battlefield. Combat was as much psychological as physical. A warrior entered battle already performing, projecting confidence, ferocity, and indifference to death. This performance mattered because it influenced the enemy before the first blow landed. To hesitate was to invite weakness. To display fearlessness was to claim power. Intimidation was deliberate. Warriors advanced loudly, voices rising together. Weapons struck against shields to create rhythm and noise. The aim was to fracture an opponent's resolve, to disrupt formation and focus. Against enemies accustomed to ordered silence and command, this chaos unsettled the senses. The Celts understood that fear could decide battles faster than blades. Terrain was another weapon. Forest edges, riverbanks, hills, and narrow passes shaped engagements. Celtic warriors favoured ground they knew, places where formations broke down and individual skill mattered. Ambushes were common. Retreats were tactical rather than shameful. Survival and opportunity outweighed rigid honour codes tied to holding ground at all costs. Defeat, when it came, did not end identity. Loss on the battlefield was painful, but it was not absolute. Because authority was not centralised, defeat did not collapse society. Warriors returned home. Leaders were judged. Alliances shifted. Life continued. This resilience frustrated enemies who expected decisive outcomes. Ritual followed violence closely. After battle, weapons were collected, not always to be reused. Many were deliberately destroyed, bent, or broken before being offered to water or earth. These acts removed weapons from human circulation and dedicated them to the other world. Victory was acknowledged not only through celebration, but through sacrifice. Violence created imbalance that ritual helped resolve. Captives occupied an ambiguous place. They could become labour, ransom, or ritual offering depending on circumstance. Enslavement existed, but it was not always permanent. Status could change. Even here, the Celtic world resisted rigid categorization. Outcomes depended on relationship, reputation, and need. Enemy perceptions shaped later history. Greek and Roman writers recorded Celtic warfare through fear and fascination. They emphasized naked warriors, wild charges, and savage customs. These descriptions exaggerated and misunderstood, but they captured something real. Celtic warriors did not fight like empire soldiers. They rejected uniformity. They valued presence over obedience. This difference forced adaptation. Roman commanders learned to counter Celtic charges with discipline and formation. They built fortifications, roads, and supply systems specifically to neutralize mobility and terrain advantage. In response, Celtic warfare adapted again. More ambush, more retreat, more reliance on landscape. Contact with empire slowly altered battlefield culture. Some Celtic groups adopted helmets, armour, and tactics from Mediterranean models. Mercenary service exposed warriors to new methods. Yet even as techniques changed, values endured. Courage, reputation, and personal honour remained central. Myth continued to shape perception of war. Heroes were remembered not for strategy, but for bravery and sacrifice. Stories preserved ideals even as realities shifted. A warrior's name mattered more than a battle's location. Memory outlived victory. This emphasis on memory explains why Celtic warfare appears both fierce and fragile. It excelled in moments of intensity but struggled against systems designed for endurance. It resisted domination but could not impose it. It preserved identity even when autonomy faded. In the end, the warriors of iron and myth did not disappear. Their battlefield culture transformed, absorbed, and echoed into later traditions. Courage remained a virtue. Song preserved deeds. Landscape continued to shape resistance. They fought not to rule the world, but to stand within it without submission. And in doing so, they created a martial culture that left marks deeper than conquest. Marks carried forward in story, in memory, and in the enduring image of the warrior who met iron with myth and chose to be remembered. Druids, gods, and the sacred world. The Celtic world was never divided cleanly between the sacred and the ordinary. There was no sharp boundary between religion and daily life, no single moment when ritual began and ended. The sacred was everywhere, in forests and rivers, in stones and skies, in memory and speech. To understand Celtic belief, one must abandon the idea of temples dominating cities and scriptures fixing truth. Celtic religion lived instead in landscape, ritual action, and spoken word, carried by people whose authority came not from writing, but from remembrance. At the heart of this sacred world stood the druids, not priests in the later sense, but guardians of knowledge. They were judges, ritual specialists, philosophers, healers and teachers. Their power did not come from controlling access to gods through buildings or texts. It came from mastery of memory. In a world without writing, those who remembered held authority. Becoming a druid required long training, often lasting many years. Knowledge was passed orally, deliberately kept from writing to preserve flexibility and secrecy. Lore, genealogy, cosmology, ritual practice, and history were memorized through repetition and performance. This was not ignorance of writing, it was refusal. Writing fixed ideas. Memory allowed adaptation. In a society built on balance rather than command, flexibility mattered more than permanence. Druids did not rule, but they shaped decisions. They advised chieftains, mediated disputes, declared sacred times, and interpreted signs. A leader who ignored them risked losing legitimacy, because authority in Celtic society rested as much on spiritual balance as on force. Power that disrupted harmony invited disaster. Religion itself was inseparable from nature. Celtic gods were not distant, abstract beings removed from the world. They were present in it. Rivers were divine, springs healed, forests watched, mountains held memory. Sacred places were not built so much as recognized, groves where trees grew ancient and undisturbed, pools where offerings accumulated, hilltops where sky and earth felt close. Ritual acts reinforced these relationships. Offerings were placed into water, buried in earth, or left in forests. Weapons were bent or broken before being given, symbolically removing them from human use. Jewelry, tools, and sometimes food were dedicated not to display wealth, but to maintain balance between worlds. These acts were not superstition, they were transactions, expressions of reciprocity with forces that shaped survival. The gods themselves were many and local. There was no single pantheon fixed across Celtic lands. Deities were tied to place and function, gods of rivers, healing, war, fertility, craft. Names shifted from region to region. A god worshipped in one valley might be unknown in another. This localization reinforced the idea that divinity lived in landscape rather than hierarchy. Time, too, was sacred. The Celtic year followed rhythms of light and dark, growth and decay. Seasonal festivals marked transitions, harvest, winter, renewal. These moments were dangerous and powerful, times when boundaries thinned and ritual was required to ensure continuity. The calendar was not merely agricultural, it was cosmological. Oral tradition carried all of this forward. Stories explained origins, taught values, preserved lore, and remembered heroes. Myth was not entertainment alone, it was instruction. Through story, the past informed the present. Through repetition, identity endured. Memory was collective. A story existed not because it was written, but because it was shared. Forgetting was loss. Remembering was survival. This gave poets and storytellers immense influence. Praise could elevate a name. Satire could destroy reputation. Words shaped reality. This sacred system created cohesion without centralization. Belief was shared, but not imposed. Ritual unified communities without demanding uniformity. The gods did not command obedience through law. They required respect through relationship. In such a world, faith was not something one practiced occasionally. It was something one lived constantly. Because the sacred permeated everything, acts of violence and acts of devotion often overlapped in ways that later observers found unsettling. Sacrifice was not an expression of cruelty for its own sake, but a means of restoring balance when ordinary exchange was no longer enough. Offerings escalated with crisis. In times of famine, war, or social fracture, gifts to the other world grew more costly, reflecting the seriousness of the disruption. Animals were most commonly offered: cattle, horses, and other valuable creatures whose loss carried weight. Weapons followed, deliberately destroyed before being given. Their usefulness ended so they could belong fully to the divine realm. In rare and extreme circumstances, human sacrifice appears in both archaeology and hostile written accounts. These acts were not routine. They were exceptional responses to perceived existential threat, moments when restoring balance demanded the highest price imaginable. The dead themselves occupied a liminal space between worlds. Burial practices varied widely, but they consistently emphasized continuity rather than finality. The afterlife was not a distant heaven or punishment realm. It was another mode of existence, close to the living, overlapping with forests, rivers and mounds. Ancestors watched, heroes lingered. The boundary between life and death was permeable. This belief shaped courage. Death in battle was not annihilation, it was transition. To die bravely ensured remembrance and presence beyond the grave. Fear of death diminished when existence continued in story, ritual, and landscape. This worldview fueled both warrior culture and ritual obligation. Sacred violence extended beyond sacrifice into law and punishment. Certain crimes were understood not merely as offences against people, but as disruptions of cosmic order. Severe wrongdoing required ritual resolution, not just compensation. Exile, execution, or dedication to the gods restored balance by removing the source of disruption. Justice, like belief, aimed at harmony rather than deterrence. Outsiders struggled to understand this system. Greek and Roman writers viewed druidic authority with suspicion and fear. They described secret knowledge, human sacrifice, and resistance to writing as signs of barbarism. In truth, what frightened them most was autonomy. Druids represented a power that empire could not easily co-opt, a class that shaped belief, law, and identity without relying on state structure. When Roman expansion reached Celtic lands, Druids became targets. Sacred groves were destroyed. Ritual sites were desecrated, not because Rome opposed religion, but because it recognized influence. To weaken resistance, Rome attacked memory. Written law replaced oral judgment. Temples replaced groves. Imperial cults attempted to overlay local belief. Yet Celtic religion did not vanish. It adapted. Gods merged. Local deities were identified with Roman ones, preserving identity beneath new names. Sacred sites shifted rather than disappeared. Springs continued to receive offerings. Stories changed shape, but not purpose. Oral tradition survived where writing imposed order. Memory retreated into households, communities, and marginal landscapes. Even conversion to new religions centuries later did not erase the old patterns. Saints replaced gods. Holy wells replaced sacred springs. Festivals aligned with ancient seasonal rhythms. The sacred geography endured because it was rooted in land, not doctrine. This persistence reveals the true strength of Celtic religion. It did not depend on buildings, texts, or centralized authority. It depended on relationship between people and place, past and present, seen and unseen. It could bend without breaking, absorb without dissolving. Druids, too, did not vanish entirely. Their functions fragmented. Judges became elders. Healers became folk practitioners. Storytellers became poets and bards. Knowledge dispersed rather than disappeared. What empire sought to destroy survived by becoming ordinary. The sacred world of the Celts was never separate from life. That is why it endured pressure that shattered more rigid systems. When gods lived in rivers rather than temples, they could not be conquered. When law lived in memory rather than stone, it could not be erased. When tradition lived in speech rather than script, it could not be burned. To understand Celtic religion, is to understand a worldview where belief was not enforced, but inhabited, where ritual was not spectacle, but maintenance, where the divine was not distant, but present in every crossing of water, every turn of season, every act remembered. The druids did not command gods, they listened, and through listening, to land, to memory, to the rhythms that shaped existence, they helped sustain a sacred world that remained alive long after history tried to silence it. Life in the hillforts, towns without cities. Life in the Celtic world did not gather itself into cities of stone and lore. It gathered instead behind earth and timber, on high ground, shaped by labour and memory. Hillforts were not cities in the classical sense, yet they were more than simple refugees. They were towns without cities, places where defence, identity, economy, and daily life overlapped without ever hardening into permanent urban centres. Hillforts rose where land itself offered advantage. Hilltops, ridges, promontories overlooking valleys, rivers, and routes of movement. Their walls followed the shape of the land rather than imposing geometry upon it. Timber palisades, earthen ramparts, and deep ditches formed layered defences that slowed attackers and displayed power. These fortifications were not symbols of empire, they were statements of belonging. To build a hill fort was to declare, this land is known, this land is held. Yet most hill forts were not continuously crowded, they were not dense cities filled with permanent populations. In times of peace, many people lived outside them, in farmsteads scattered across surrounding land. The hill fort stood ready, a place to gather in danger, trade in season, negotiate disputes, and perform ritual. It was a centre without being a capital. Daily life flowed between hill fort and countryside. At dawn, smoke rose from roundhouses clustered within walls or scattered nearby. Families tended animals, repaired tools, ground grain, wove cloth, and prepared food. Life was labour-intensive and seasonal. Survival depended on coordination more than command. Everyone worked. Children learned through doing. Elders guided through memory rather than instruction. Roundhouses formed the core of domestic life, built of timber frames, wattle walls, and thatched roofs. They were warm, adaptable, and communal. A single space held hearth, work, sleep, and story. Fire was constant. Smoke blackened beams and preserved wood. Evenings brought shared meals, repair of tools, and the retelling of stories that reinforced identity. Craft activity was woven into daily routine. Smiths worked iron within or near hill forts, repairing weapons, tools, and fittings. Pottery was shaped locally. Woodworkers built carts, fences, and structures. Weaving produced cloth essential for warmth and status. Craft was not segregated into guilds or districts. It existed wherever need arose. Hill forts also functioned as nodes of exchange. Traders arrived with goods carried along rivers and paths, salt, metals, livestock, luxury items from distant lands. These exchanges were not anonymous markets governed by law. They were social events, bound by reputation and relationship. Trust mattered, memory mattered. A dishonest trader did not return safely. Food storage was a constant concern. Pits held grain. Livestock were counted and protected. Famine was never far from memory. Hill forts offered security for stored surplus, allowing communities to endure lean years. This storage did not create bureaucratic control, but it did create obligation. Those who controlled access gained influence, not authority. Defence shaped every aspect of design. Entrances were narrow and complex, forcing attackers into vulnerable positions. Ramparts were rebuilt and reinforced over generations, layered with history as much as earth. These defences were not just practical, they were psychological. They announced strength, continuity, and preparedness. Yet warfare did not dominate daily life. Most days were quiet, shaped by routine and season. The presence of walls did not mean constant fear, it meant readiness. Hillforts embodied the understanding that danger came unpredictably from rival groups, raids, or distant threats, and that survival depended on collective response. Social life concentrated within these spaces during festivals, negotiations, and crises. Feasts reinforced hierarchy and obligation. Disputes were mediated. Alliances were forged. Rituals marked seasonal transitions. The hill fort became a stage where society performed itself. This flexible use prevented stagnation. Hill forts could expand, contract, or be abandoned as circumstances changed. When land tired or routes shifted, people moved. New hill forts rose. Old ones fell silent. Continuity lived in people, not buildings. From the outside, this looked like a lack of progress. To the Celts, it was freedom. Cities locked people into structures that demanded obedience and permanence. Hill forts offered security without surrendering mobility. Life in these towns without cities balanced protection with independence, community with flexibility. They were expressions of a world that valued resilience over monument, presence over permanence. When danger finally arrived, the hill fort shifted from gathering place to shield. Signals moved quickly across the landscape. Smoke by day, fire by night, messengers along paths known only to locals. Families and herds converged on the heights. Gates were barred. Entrances that felt welcoming in peace became traps for attackers, forcing them into narrow turns overlooked by defenders. Earth and timber, shaped patiently over generations, turned a knowledge of place into advantage. Defence was communal. There were no standing garrisons waiting for orders. Every able body had a role. Warriors took the walls, others carried water, stones and supplies. Children were moved inward. Elders directed from memory, recalling how the fort had held before, where ramparts were strongest, where weakness had once appeared. Hill fort defence was less about dramatic assaults and more about endurance, about denying quick victory and making cost outweigh reward. Sieges were rarely long by later standards. Attackers struggled to maintain supply, especially in hostile terrain. The defender's goal was not annihilation, but survival. A raid repelled preserved autonomy. A costly defence discouraged return. Even if a hill fort fell, it did not end the people. They scattered, regrouped, and rebuilt elsewhere. The fort was a tool, not the soul. Within the walls, hierarchy became visible, but remained flexible. Chieftains occupied prominent dwellings, hosted feasts, and coordinated defence, yet they did so among their people rather than above them. Authority rested on performance. In crisis, leadership sharpened. In peace, it softened again. Specialists, smiths, ritual leaders, judges moved easily through the space, their influence recognised without formal office. Feasting inside the hill fort reaffirmed bonds. After danger passed, shared meals, redistributed resources, honoured bravery, and restored balance. Stories of the defence were told and retold, weaving the fort's walls into memory. Children learned not only where they lived, but why it mattered. The hill fort became biography as much as architecture. Ritual threaded through daily life here as well. Gates and ramparts carried meaning beyond defence. Offerings might be placed at entrances or buried in ditches, asking unseen forces to guard thresholds. Wells and springs within walls were treated with respect. The fort was not merely built upon the land, it was in conversation with it. Over time, some hill forts grew large enough to feel almost urban. Workshops clustered, trade intensified. Imported goods appeared more frequently. Yet even these never crossed fully into cityhood. Density rose and fell with season and circumstance. Permanence remained optional. The ability to leave without losing identity was preserved. This flexibility proved crucial when outside pressures increased. As Mediterranean powers expanded northward, hillforts faced new kinds of threats, sustained campaigns, engineered sieges, and armies trained to dismantle earthworks methodically. Some forts were modified, ramparts strengthened, gates reworked. Others were abandoned, their roles shifting from defence to memory. Abandonment did not mean failure. When routes changed or pressure mounted, people moved their centres of life. New forts rose in better positions. Old ones became landmarks, places of story, ritual, and remembrance. Grass reclaimed walls, trees rooted into ditches. The land absorbed what had been built, preserving it quietly. Under prolonged external domination, hill forts transformed again. Some were reoccupied as administrative centres by new rulers. Others remained empty, their presence still shaping movement and imagination. Even when their military function faded, their symbolic power endured. They marked ancestral territory. They reminded communities who had lived there before. Hill forts survived as ideas as much as places. They taught that security did not require surrender to permanence, that community could gather without being trapped, and that defence could be shared rather than imposed. In a world that rewarded resilience, these towns without cities proved their worth, again and again. Life in the hill forts was therefore not a pause between battles or a prelude to cities. It was a complete way of living, one that balanced readiness with routine, hierarchy with kinship, and defence with flexibility. People worked, celebrated, argued, worshipped, and remembered within walls that rose from earth and returned to it. When later observers searched for cities and found none, they mistook difference for absence. The hill fort was not a failed city. It was an answer shaped by land and belief, an answer that kept communities alive at the edge of the ancient world. And long after walls softened and gates fell silent, the logic that built them remained. Gather when needed, disperse when wise, defend together, and let the land carry memory forward. Craft, trade, and Celtic wealth. Wealth in the Celtic world did not take the form of towering treasuries, coin-filled vaults, or centralised markets governed by law. It moved instead through hands, along paths, across rivers, and between relationships. Celtic wealth was visible, portable, and deeply social. It existed to be displayed, exchanged, and redistributed, not stored and forgotten. To understand Celtic craft and trade is to understand an economy built not on accumulation, but on circulation. At the heart of Celtic wealth stood craft, especially metalwork. Celtic artisans were among the most skilled metalworkers of Iron Age Europe, producing objects that were not only functional, but symbolic. Weapons, jewellery, tools, and ritual objects were shaped with extraordinary care. Gold torques twisted around the necks of elites, iron swords balanced for intimate combat, shields adorned with flowing designs that seemed alive. These objects were not luxuries alone. They were statements of identity. Metalworking knowledge spread widely, but mastery carried prestige. Smiths occupied a respected position within communities. They transformed raw earth into tools of survival and symbols of power. Iron ore, copper, tin, and gold were drawn from local landscapes and distant sources alike. The act of forging itself carried ritual weight. Fire, hammer, and anvil bridged worlds, turning stone into blade, ore into ornament. Celtic art expressed values as clearly as economics. Flowing lines, spirals, animal forms, and abstract motion dominated design. These were not decorative trends. They reflected worldview. Movement mattered more than symmetry. Transformation mattered more than permanence. Objects appeared to breathe, twist, and shift as light moved across them. Wealth was alive. Gold played a special role. It did not corrode, it shone without decay. Gold objects, especially torques, arm rings, and ceremonial pieces, marked status and sacred authority. They were worn in ritual and battle alike, blurring the line between spiritual and social power. Gold was less a store of value than a visible language of rank. Iron and bronze shaped daily life more directly. Farming tools improved productivity. Weapons increased personal power. Household objects, knives, fittings, cauldrons, supported communal living. Craft production was not isolated in factories or districts. It occurred within settlements, often near hillforts, embedded in daily routine. Trade bound these communities together. Rivers served as highways long before roads. The Danube, Rhine, Rhone, and Atlantic coastal routes carried goods across vast distances. Overland paths linked valleys, salt mines, forests, and pastures. Traders moved carefully, relying on hospitality, reputation, and memory rather than contracts. Certain materials defined long-distance exchange. Salt preserved food and sustained life. Amber from the Baltic travelled south, prized for its glow and rarity. Metals moved in both. Directions: raw or outward, finished goods inward. Livestock, hides, textiles, and slaves form part of this exchange, though rarely recorded directly. Mediterranean goods flowed north as well. Wine, glass, ceramics, and luxury items reached Celtic lands, especially in later periods. These imports did not create dependency. They became tools of status and diplomacy. A wine vessel displayed at a feast signalled connection and prestige. It did not replace local customs. Foreign goods were absorbed into Celtic systems rather than reshaping them. Coinage appeared unevenly and late. Some Celtic groups minted coins inspired by Greek models, often abstracting faces and symbols into distinctly Celtic designs. Coins were used primarily in trade and gift exchange, not as universal currency. Barter, obligation, and reputation still dominated economic life. Wealth was measured in cattle, land access, followers, and honour as much as metal. Feasting acted as economic engine. Leaders gathered surplus, food, goods, weapons, and redistributed it publicly. This reinforced hierarchy while preventing hoarding. A wealthy leader who did not give lost legitimacy. Redistribution turned economic inequality into social cohesion. Trade also moved ideas. Styles spread. Techniques travelled. Stories crossed regions. Craft motifs appeared far from their origin, adapted locally. This networked economy allowed cultural unity without political control. Yet Celtic wealth always remained vulnerable. It depended on peace, movement, and relationship. Disruption, war, famine, external conquest could fracture networks quickly, but the same flexibility that limited accumulation also allowed recovery. Trade routes shifted, craft adapted, wealth reformed in new places. This was not an economy of growth without end. It was an economy of balance between taking and giving, producing and sharing, displaying and remembering. The people who carried this wealth across landscapes were not anonymous, merchants protected by law, but travellers bound to memory and reputation. Movement required trust. A trader's safety depended on relationships cultivated over years. Hospitality owed, favours returned, kinship extended through marriage and alliance. Routes were remembered rather than mapped. Knowledge of where to stop, whom to approach, and which seasons were safest mattered more than speed. In this way, commerce deepened social ties rather than replacing them. Markets existed, but they were episodic. They gathered around festivals, hill fort assemblies, and seasonal crossroads. Exchange was face-to-face, negotiated aloud, and witnessed by community. Price was not fixed by abstraction. It flexed with need, status, and circumstance. A good traded to seal an alliance carried different value than the same good exchanged for survival. Obligation lingered after the exchange, creating ongoing relationship rather than clean closure. Labour underpinned all of this. Most work was household based, fields tilled, animals tended, tools repaired, cloth woven. Specialists existed, but they were embedded in community life. Smiths, woodworkers, potters and weavers did not operate apart from society. They served it. Their skill brought respect, sometimes patronage, but rarely isolation. Craft knowledge passed through apprenticeship and kinship, ensuring continuity even when settlements shifted. Slavery and unfree labour formed a darker strand of the economy. Captives taken in war, debtors, and the dispossessed could be bound to service. Their labour contributed to households and elites alike. Yet even here, rigidity was rare. Status could change. Freedom might be regained through service, marriage, or compensation. This fluidity did not erase suffering, but it reflected a system that resisted permanent categories. Wealth moved upward and outward, but it also flowed back. Feasts redistributed surplus. Gifts circulated to bind followers. Ritual offerings removed wealth from circulation altogether, dedicating it to unseen powers. This removal was intentional. By sacrificing value, communities reaffirmed that prosperity depended on balance, not hoarding. Economic success carried obligation to people, to place, to the sacred. As contact with Mediterranean powers intensified, these networks faced pressure. New goods arrived in greater quantity. Demand increased. Some leaders grew wealthier, more connected, more ambitious. Trade corridors hardened. Coinage spread unevenly. Economic differences sharpened in certain regions. Yet even as change accelerated, older patterns persisted beneath the surface. Imperial expansion disrupted circulation profoundly. Roads redirected movement. Taxes extracted surplus. Markets standardized exchange. Where empire imposed permanence, Celtic economies lost flexibility. Some craft traditions declined. Others adapted, producing for new tastes. Hillfort workshops fell silent as administrative centres drew activity elsewhere. Yet knowledge did not vanish. It migrated. In regions less tightly controlled, older systems endured longer. Barter remained common. Feasting continued to bind communities. Local craft styles persisted. Even where coinage became widespread, cattle, land access, and reputation remained measures of wealth. The economy did not become fully monetized because social value still mattered more than abstract price. Over time, Celtic wealth transformed rather than disappeared. Gold talks gave way to new symbols. Iron tools evolved. Trade routes shifted again. What remained constant was the principle that wealth existed to be seen, shared, and remembered. Objects carried stories. Exchange carried obligation. Prosperity demanded participation. Craft and trade had never been about accumulation alone. They were about connection between people and land, maker and object, giver and receiver. When political independence faded, these connections preserved identity quietly. Skills passed on. Roots remembered. Meanings endured. The Celtic economy, like the society that sustained it, thrived on movement and balance. It was resilient because it did not depend on a single centre or a single form of value. When one path closed, another opened. When one symbol lost meaning, another took its place. In this way, Celtic wealth was never merely material, it was relational. And because relationships could adapt when structures fell, craft and trade continued to shape life long after empires tried to redefine what wealth should be. Women, law, and power in Celtic society. Power in Celtic society did not flow in a single direction. nor did it belong exclusively to men, kings, or warriors. It moved through relationships between genders, families, and generations, shaped by custom rather than rigid law. To understand Celtic society is to recognise that balance mattered more than dominance, and that women occupied positions of influence that later civilizations often struggled to comprehend. Celtic society was not equal in the modern sense, but it was not strictly patriarchal either. Gender roles existed, yet they were flexible, shaped by lineage, wealth, reputation, and circumstance rather than enforced uniformly by law. A woman's position depended not only on her sex, but on who she was connected to, what she owned, and how she was remembered. Women were central to kinship, and kinship was the foundation of power. Lineage determined land access, alliance, and status. Through marriage, women linked clans and tribes, forging political and economic bonds that outlasted individual leaders. Marriage was not simply personal union, it was contract and strategy. Women were not passive objects in this process. In many regions, they retained rights to property, inheritance, and divorce, reflecting a legal tradition focused on balance rather than control. Celtic law, customary rather than written, recognised women as legal persons. They could own property, bring disputes, and receive compensation for wrongs. Marriage contracts outlined obligations on both sides, including provisions for separation. This did not eliminate inequality, but it did provide agency. A woman wronged was not invisible to the law. Her status mattered. Inheritance practices varied across regions, but they often allowed women to hold wealth independently. Dowries were not simple transfers of ownership. They represented shared investment between families. In cases of divorce or death, women could reclaim property brought into marriage. This economic autonomy translated into social influence. Women also played visible roles in ritual and belief. As healers, seers, and keepers of tradition, they participated in maintaining spiritual balance. The sacred world did not exclude them. In some cases, women served as ritual leaders or intermediaries, reinforcing the idea that authority came from knowledge and connection rather than gender alone. Historical and legendary figures hint at women who wielded overt political and military power. While not typical, female leaders did exist, commanding respect through lineage, charisma, and capability. Their presence shocked later Roman writers who viewed such authority as unnatural. In Celtic terms, it was situational. When a woman could lead, she did. Daily life reflected this balance. Women worked fields, managed households, produced textiles, and oversaw food storage, roles essential to survival. Control over food and production meant control over stability. In these times of scarcity, those who managed resources shaped outcomes. Power often rested quietly in these roles rather than loudly on the battlefield. Law reinforced social equilibrium. Justice was not about punishment imposed from above, but about restoring balance between people. Women participated in this system as claimants, witnesses, and beneficiaries. Wrongdoing against a woman disrupted not only her life, but the harmony of kin groups, demanding resolution through compensation and mediation. Children learned these norms early. Gender shaped expectation, but not destiny. Ability mattered. Reputation mattered. Memory mattered most. A woman remembered as wise, generous, or formidable carried influence long after individual acts faded. From the outside, this society appeared inconsistent. Roman and Greek observers alternately exaggerated Celtic women as savage warriors or dismissed them as primitive. Both views missed the truth. Celtic society allowed space for female authority because it did not lock power into fixed offices. Influence moved where it was earned. This flexibility strengthened social resilience. When leaders fell, families endured. When men died in war, women maintained continuity, holding land, raising children, preserving memory. The system did not collapse because authority was shared, yet limits existed. Not all women held power. Inequality persisted. Enslaved women and those without strong kinship ties faced vulnerability. Celtic society was not idealized equality, it was negotiated balance. That balance between men and women, force and law, tradition and adaptation, formed the core of Celtic power. Authority was not seized, it was sustained. That endurance became most visible when pressure mounted and ordinary structures were tested. In moments of crisis, war, famine, political fracture, women often moved from the background of daily stability into the foreground of decision making. This was not a sudden inversion of roles, but a continuation of a system that valued capability and connection over fixed titles. When continuity was threatened, those best positioned to preserve it acted. Female leadership appeared most clearly in times of conflict and diplomacy. Some women led war bands, negotiated alliances, or directed resistance. Their authority did not rest on novelty, but on lineage, wealth, and reputation. If a woman commanded loyalty, it was because she had earned it. Celtic society did not require a man to stand between competence and command. Roman writers, encountering such figures, often reacted with disbelief or alarm, projecting their own anxieties onto cultures they did not understand. Law in practice reinforced this flexibility. Because it was customary and oral, law could respond to circumstance. Judges weighed precedent, status, and consequence rather than applying rigid codes. Women brought cases, negotiated settlements, and received compensation. In disputes involving marriage, property, or injury, outcomes reflected social balance rather than blanket rules. Justice aimed to restore harmony between families and clans, not to punish abstract wrongdoing. Marriage contracts reveal this balance clearly. They outlined mutual obligations, support, fidelity, compensation, not ownership. Separation was possible, and property division recognised prior contributions. This did not make relationships equal in every sense, but it acknowledged autonomy. A marriage that failed to serve balance could be dissolved without destroying social order. Women's economic roles amplified their influence. Control over textile production, food storage, and household management placed them at the centre of survival. Cloth was wealth, essential for warmth, trade, and status. Food security determined whether communities endured winter. Those who managed these resources wielded quiet but decisive power. Leadership did not always shout, it often organised. Ritual life continued to offer women space for authority. Healing, divination, and guardianship of sacred practices were not restricted by gender. Knowledge conferred power, and knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship and memory. Women who mastered ritual knowledge shaped belief and behaviour, influencing decisions that affected entire communities. This balance also protected society against collapse. When warfare removed men, women maintained farms, negotiated alliances, and preserved lineage. Children learned identity through mothers and elders as much as through warriors. Memory survived because it was shared. Authority did not disappear with a single death. Roman conquest tested these systems severely. Imperial law replaced customary mediation. Property was redefined. Male-dominated administration imposed rigid categories. In some regions, women's legal standing narrowed under foreign rule. Yet even here, older patterns endured beneath the surface. Custom persisted in households. Kinship continued to shape alliance. Sacred roles adapted rather than vanished. Over time, New religious frameworks layered themselves over older beliefs, but they often preserved familiar rhythms. Female saints replaced goddesses. Holy women assumed roles once held by ritual specialists. Law softened again at local levels, shaped by memory and practice rather than decree. Balance reasserted itself quietly. What emerges from this long view is not a society of simple equality or simple hierarchy, but one of negotiated power. Gender shaped roles, but it did not define destiny. Law constrained behaviour, but it did not freeze it. Authority existed to preserve balance, not to enforce dominance. This is why Celtic society appears inconsistent in later accounts. Observers searched for rules and found relationships. They searched for kings and found families. They searched for fixed gender boundaries and found movement. What they called contradiction was adaptability. Women, law, and power were woven together into a social fabric designed to endure change. When conditions shifted, the fabric stretched rather than tore. Influence moved where it was needed. Stability returned through adjustment, not enforcement. In the end, Celtic power did not reside solely in warriors, chieftains, or ritual leaders. It resided in the balance between them, in a system that allowed women to hold land, speak in law, shape belief, and lead when circumstance demanded. This balance did not make the Celts immune to conquest, but it made them resilient to erasure. Authority passed quietly from hand to hand. Memory outlasted rule. And through women, law, and the careful maintenance of social balance, Celtic society preserved itself long after its political independence faded from history's page. Celts versus Rome. Clash with an empire. The clash between the Celts and Rome was not a single war, nor a clean story of conquest and submission. It was a long collision between two ways of organising life that were fundamentally incompatible. Rome was centralised, written, bureaucratic, and expansionist, built on discipline, law, and permanent control. The Celtic world was fragmented, oral, relational, and adaptive, rooted in land, kinship, and memory rather than institutions. When these systems met, violence followed, but so did transformation, resistance, and cultural negotiation. For centuries, the two worlds existed at a distance. Celtic peoples traded with Mediterranean societies, served as mercenaries, and appeared in rumour and fear long before Rome marched north in force. To Romans, the lands beyond the Alps were dangerous and undefined, full of forests, fierce warriors, and peoples who refused order. To the Celts, Rome was powerful but distant, another force moving along. Trade routes and political currents. That distance collapsed as Rome expanded outward. Roman conquest was not accidental, it was structural. Military success fueled political power, and political ambition demanded new wars. As Roman influence spread into northern Italy, it collided first with Celtic groups already settled there. These early encounters were brutal and memorable. Roman armies suffered devastating defeats in earlier centuries, losses that haunted Roman historical memory and shaped deep cultural fear of Celtic warriors. When Rome returned north with greater organisation and intent, it came prepared. The Roman army was unlike anything the Celts had faced consistently. Legionaries trained relentlessly to fight as a unit. Discipline mattered more than individual heroics. Shields locked together. Orders were obeyed without debate. Roads, supply lines, and camps allowed armies to move, feed themselves, and return year after year. Rome did not fight battles alone, it fought systems. Celtic warfare, by contrast, emphasized personal valour, speed, intimidation, and knowledge of terrain. Celtic warriors could overwhelm opponents in sudden clashes, ambushes, and raids. Against poorly prepared enemies, they were devastating. But against disciplined legions able to hold formation under pressure, their strengths became vulnerabilities. Rome learned quickly. Celtic charges were absorbed, slowed, and broken by walls of shields and coordinated counterattacks. What began as terrifying encounters became predictable engagements. Roman commanders adapted tactics specifically to neutralize Celtic ferocity. The decisive moment came with the Roman invasion of Gaul under Julius Caesar. This was not merely a military campaign, it was a political project. Caesar needed conquest to secure power at home, and Gaul offered wealth, land, and prestige. The region was rich but divided, its tribes bound by rivalry as much as kinship. Rome exploited this fragmentation relentlessly. Some Celtic tribes allied with Rome to gain advantage over rivals. Others resisted fiercely. Alliances shifted constantly. Rome negotiated, threatened, bribed, and punished, isolating resistance one group at a time. What Rome faced was not a united Celtic world, but dozens of local struggles unfolding simultaneously. Yet resistance did not disappear. The most serious challenge came when Celtic resistance briefly unified under Vercingetorix, who recognised that open battle favoured Roman discipline. He adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying food supplies, denying Rome easy victories, and forcing the legions into difficult terrain. For a moment, Roman momentum stalled. The Celtic world showed it could adapt strategically, not just courageously. That moment ended at Alesia. There, Rome demonstrated the full weight of imperial warfare. Roman engineers built massive fortifications not only to besiege the city, but to defend against relief armies. Walls faced inward and outward. Logistics, discipline, and engineering turned the landscape itself into a weapon. Celtic bravery and sacrifice were immense, but bravery could not overcome infrastructure. When Alesia fell, organised resistance in Gaul fractured, but conquest did not mean submission. Across the Celtic world, resistance continued in different forms. In Iberia, in the Alps, and later in Britain, rebellions flared repeatedly. Some were crushed quickly, others endured for decades. Rome learned that holding land was easier than reshaping identity. Forests still sheltered rebels. Hills still resisted roads. Memory still preserved difference. Roman occupation changed daily life profoundly. Roads cut through landscapes that once resisted permanence. Forts anchored authority. Taxes extracted surplus. Written law replaced customary mediation. Roman towns rose where hillforts once gathered people seasonally. To Rome, this was civilization. To many Celts, it was dislocation. Yet the collision was not one-sided. Rome changed as well. Celtic warriors became Roman auxiliaries, bringing their fighting styles into imperial service. Celtic gods merged with Roman ones. Local elites entered Roman administration, reshaping empire from within. Roman culture absorbed what it conquered, even as it claimed dominance. Identity became layered. Some Celts adopted Roman language, dress, and law to gain security and status. Others retreated into marginal lands, preserving older ways. Many lived between, Roman in public, Celtic in memory. Culture did not vanish, it adapted. This is where the true collision occurred, not on battlefields, but in everyday life. Rome imposed order, the Celts preserved meaning. One reshaped land, the other reshaped survival. In the decades that followed the conquest of Gaul, the collision spread outward, reaching places Rome had long feared and coveted. Britain, separated by water and rumour, became the next testing ground. There, resistance took forms Rome recognised, and forms it did not. The terrain was wetter, the forests thicker, the social networks tighter. Roman roads advanced, but slowly. Forts appeared like nails driven into unfamiliar ground. holding space but not loyalty. Resistance flared not only in open battle but in refusal. Refusal to pay, to comply, to abandon old sacred places. When revolt erupted, it did so with ferocity born of accumulated grievance. The uprising led by Boudicca shocked Roman authorities precisely because it defied their expectations. It revealed that leadership could arise outside Roman categories, that grievance could unite disparate groups, and that conquest without consent remained fragile. The revolt was crushed with devastating force. Yet the lesson endured. Order imposed by roads and law did not erase memory. Across the provinces, Rome refined its approach. Where direct suppression failed, accommodation followed. Local elites were co-opted, given Roman titles, land and citizenship. Urban centres were encouraged, markets regulated, and taxes standardised. Roman law replaced customary mediation, promising predictability in exchange for obedience. Some communities prospered under this arrangement, others endured it. Romanisation was uneven and incomplete. In towns, Latin spread. In countryside, older languages persisted. In courts, written contracts ruled. In households, oral custom remained. Temples rose in stone, yet springs and groves continued to receive offerings. Gods were renamed rather than banished. The sacred landscapes survived beneath imperial architecture. Military integration deepened the exchange. Celtic warriors entered Roman service as auxiliaries, carrying their skills to distant frontiers. They learned discipline and engineering. Rome learned mobility and local knowledge. Veterans returned home with pay, status, and new identities, bridges between worlds. This circulation blurred boundaries, creating hybrid cultures that were neither fully Roman nor wholly Celtic. Economically, the impact cut both ways. Roman roads and markets increased circulation and demand, but also extracted surplus. Coinage spread, yet barter and obligation persisted. Craft adapted to new tastes without abandoning old forms. Some hillforts declined, others transformed into administrative or ritual cities. Abandonment did not equal erasure. Over generations, resistance shifted from battlefield to memory. Open revolt became rarer, quiet persistence became common. Language endured in songs and place names. Law lingered in practice even when codes changed. Festivals aligned to imperial calendars yet kept ancient rhythms. Identity learned to survive by bending. From Rome's perspective, the Celts were absorbed. From the Celtic perspective, the world had narrowed but not ended. Autonomy faded, meaning endured. What could not be held by force, belief, kinship, memory, proved difficult to uproot. This long collision reshaped Europe. It produced provinces that fed an empire and cultures that outlasted it. When Roman power eventually receded, what remained was not a vacuum but a layered inheritance. Roads crumbled, towns shrank, administrations vanished, but names, customs, and sacred geographies persisted. The Celtic world, altered and compressed, re-emerged in new forms. The clash with Rome was therefore not a simple story of defeat. It was a negotiation across centuries, violent at first, subtle thereafter, between permanence and flexibility, law and relationship, empire and land. Rome conquered space, the Celts preserved place, and in that preservation, quiet, stubborn, adaptive, the older world survived the newer one, carrying forward a sense of belonging that no empire, however vast, could fully command. The Celts at the edge of the world. At the far western edge of the ancient world, where land dissolved into ocean and the horizon felt endless, Celtic life took on its most enduring forms. Britain and Ireland were not the heartlands of Celtic expansion, but they became its strongholds. Distance, water, and weather combined to create spaces where empire arrived late, unevenly, or not at all. Here, on the Atlantic fringe, the Celtic world narrowed, but it also deepened. In Britain, Celtic societies developed in constant conversation with isolation. Rivers were shorter, forests thicker, and coastlines more broken than on the continent. Communities clustered around hillforts and farmsteads, bound tightly to land and kin. Movement existed, but it was shaped by sea crossings and seasonal rhythms rather than long continental corridors. Identity became more insular, more place-bound. Roman conquest reached Britain, but it never fully conquered it. Roads and forts carved authority into parts of the landscape, yet beyond those lines, older ways persisted. In the north and west, imperial control thinned, hillforts remained active, customary law continued. Sacred places endured beneath new names. Even within Roman towns, Celtic belief and practice adapted rather than vanished. Ireland, by contrast, lay beyond Rome's grasp. In Ireland, the Atlantic acted as a shield. Without Roman occupation, Celtic social structures developed with fewer external constraints. There were no imperial roads, no legions, no administrative towns imposed from outside. Power remained local. Kinship ruled. Law stayed oral. Memory continued to govern. This isolation preserved older patterns. Hillforts and ringforts anchored territory. Kingship existed, but it remained limited, more symbolic than absolute. Authority depended on alliance, reputation, and ritual legitimacy. The sacred landscape flourished. Wells, groves, and boundary places multiplied in importance. The other world felt close, woven into daily life through story and ritual. Seafaring connected these edge societies to one another. The Atlantic was not a barrier, but a road. Boats moved along coastlines and between islands, carrying people, goods, and ideas. This maritime network linked Western Britain, Ireland, and parts of the European coast, creating a shared Atlantic Celtic culture distinct from continental forms. Trade existed, but it was intimate, rooted in familiarity rather than scale. Language and story flourished here. Without the pressure of imperial administration, oral tradition expanded into elaborate myth cycles, genealogies, and legal memory. Poets and storytellers became central figures, preserving identity through speech. History did not need writing to endure, it lived in performance. Christianity later arrived not as a conquering force, but as a layer. In Ireland especially, new belief merged with old rhythms. Saints replaced gods, monasteries rose near sacred wells, manuscripts preserved. Stories shaped by centuries of oral tradition. The Atlantic fringe became a place where Celtic identity did not merely survive, it transformed and projected itself forward. This endurance was not accidental, it was the result of geography that resisted uniform control and communities that valued memory over monument. At the edge of the world, Celtic culture learned how to compress without breaking, how to retreat without disappearing. Isolation, which might have weakened other societies, became a source of strength along the Atlantic fringe. Distance from imperial centres slowed change and softened pressure. Where Rome demanded uniformity, the western lands answered with variation. Communities learned to survive on smaller scales, relying on kinship and reciprocity rather than infrastructure. When connections narrowed, relationships deepened. In Western Britain, imperial presence thinned quickly beyond roads and forts. The farther one travelled from administrative centres, the more continuity asserted itself. Local leaders negotiated coexistence rather than submission. Old law persisted alongside new. Ritual adapted quietly. Sacred places shifted names but not meaning. Even after Roman withdrawal, these regions did not collapse. They resumed patterns already centuries old. Ireland's position beyond empire allowed those patterns to evolve without interruption. There, social organisation remained intensely local. Kingship existed, but it was layered and limited. High kings depended on alliance and ritual legitimacy, not coercive power. Law remained customary, preserved by specialists who memorized precedents and genealogies. Justice sought balance, not enforcement. Memory remained authority. The Atlantic sea lanes tied these worlds together. Coastal travel connected Western Britain, Ireland, the Hebrides, and farther shores. Boats hugged coasts, crossed short stretches, and moved with seasons. This maritime web exchanged cattle, metals, textiles, and stories. It spread styles and beliefs without central control. The ocean did not isolate, it connected selectively. This Atlantic Celtic identity differed from continental forms. Art favoured interlace and abstraction. Ritual emphasised liminal places, shorelines, estuaries, islands, where worlds met. The other world felt close, reachable through mist, water, and story. Festivals followed seasonal thresholds marked by light and weather rather than calendars imposed from afar. Language endured here longest. Without the pressure of administration and schooling, speech remained communal and flexible. Dialects diversified, yet stayed intelligible across regions. Place names anchored memory to land. Stories carried lore and history forward. Poets and judges became pillars of society, not because they commanded force, but because they preserved continuity. When Christianity arrived, it arrived differently. It did not come on the backs of legions, it came through travellers, teachers, and small communities. In Ireland especially, new belief merged with older rhythms. Monasteries grew near sacred waters. Saints absorbed attributes of local deities. The calendar aligned with ancient seasons. Writing finally entered the world, not to erase memory, but to preserve it. This fusion projected Celtic identity into the future. Manuscripts recorded stories shaped by oral tradition. Lore tracks captured custom without freezing it entirely. Art carried ancient motifs into new media. The Atlantic Fringe became not a museum of the past, but a workshop of transformation. When continental Celtic societies faded under the weight of empire, the edge carried on. It compressed, adapted, and endured. The world narrowed, but it did not end. What survived did so because it had always been built for resilience, small-scale authority, flexible law, sacred landscapes, and memory shared aloud. The Celts at the edge of the world did not preserve identity by resisting change outright. They preserved it by absorbing change selectively, reshaping it to fit land and relationship. Isolation slowed erasure. Water deflected uniformity. Community outlasted administration. In the end, the Atlantic Fringe became the keeper of a world that had learned long ago how to live without cities, without empires, and without permanence. When power shifted and systems fell, this way of life remained ready to continue. At the edge, where land meets ocean, the Celtic world found not its end, but its afterlife. Collapse, absorption, and survival. Collapse in the Celtic world did not arrive as a single moment of fire and silence. It came unevenly, quietly, and differently from place to place. There was no final battle after which Celtic society ceased to exist, no date that marked its end. Instead, there was absorption, fragmentation, and survival, three processes unfolding at once, reshaping the old world without fully erasing it. Romanization was the most visible force of change. Where Rome established lasting control, it brought roads, towns, taxation, written law, and administrative order. These were not merely tools of governance, they were instruments of cultural pressure. The Roman way of life rewarded permanence, literacy, and hierarchy, values that conflicted with the Celtic preference for flexibility, memory, and local authority. In many regions, especially Gaul and southern Britain, the change was profound. Hillforts that once gathered communities seasonally fell quiet. People moved into Roman towns, attracted or compelled by trade, security, and status. Stone buildings replaced timber. Coinage replaced obligation. Written contracts replaced customary negotiation. Law became something issued, not remembered. This shift did not require violence alone. It worked because it offered advantage. Local elites who cooperated gained wealth, protection, and prestige. Roman citizenship became a prize. Latin became the language of power. Over generations, participation turned into habit. Children grew up inside Roman systems without ever knowing the old balance. Yet this was not total erasure. Romanization was uneven. Cities flourished while countryside lagged. Towns adopted Roman customs quickly. Rural areas retained older ways longer. Even within Romanized zones, daily life often remained quietly Celtic. Families still relied on kinship networks. Customary law persisted in practice, if not in court. Sacred places endured beneath new names. Fragmentation accelerated this process. The Celtic world had never been unified, and under Roman pressure, its lack of central coordination became a vulnerability. Resistance collapsed not because it failed everywhere, but because it failed locally, one community at a time. Alliances dissolved, trade networks shifted, old leaders lost relevance. What remained was not a single defeated culture, but many altered ones. As political autonomy faded, cultural identity compressed. Elements that depended on independence, tribal warfare, large-scale feasting, autonomous law, declined. Elements that could survive privately, language, story, ritual, memory, retreated into households and local communities. Celtic culture did not vanish, it shrank inward. This inward turn mattered. Where public identity was Roman, private identity remained local. People learned to navigate two worlds. In town, they spoke Latin and followed imperial rules. At home, they preserved stories, customs, and sacred habits shaped by land and ancestry. Identity became layered rather than replaced. Economic change reinforced this shift. Roman markets favoured standardization. Craft adapted to imperial demand. Some traditional industries declined. Others found new outlets. Wealth moved through official channels now, taxed and recorded. Yet older measures of value, land, cattle, reputation, continued to matter where coin could not reach. Religion changed in similar ways. Roman temples rose, but springs, groves, and boundary places continued to receive offerings. Gods merged rather than disappeared. Sacred geography endured even when architecture changed. The divine remained tied to place, not doctrine. The decline of the Western Roman Empire introduced a new phase of uncertainty. As imperial authority weakened, towns emptied, roads fell into disrepair, and administration withdrew. For societies built around Roman permanence, this collapse was catastrophic. For communities that remembered older ways, it was disruptive, but survivable. In former Celtic lands, people adapted again. Without imperial order, local authority resurfaced. Kinship regained importance. Customary law reasserted itself. Memory filled gaps left by bureaucracy. The old logic returned, not because it had waited unchanged, but because it had never fully left. This is the paradox of Celtic decline: politically absorbed, culturally fragmented, yet socially resilient. What collapsed was not the Celtic world itself, but the space it once occupied, openly. It lost visibility, not substance. Its structures dissolved, but its instincts endured. When imperial structures finally withdrew, the world that followed did not resemble a simple return to the past. Roads cracked, towns emptied, and written administration receded, but people did not become unmoored. They adapted, again, using habits learned long before Rome arrived. In regions once deeply Romanized, the sudden absence of authority created uncertainty. In regions where Roman presence had always been thin, life resumed patterns already familiar. Local power reasserted itself quickly. Kinship networks replaced civic offices. Landholding mattered more than titles. Customary law, never fully erased, rose back into prominence, carried by elders and memory keepers who understood precedent better than any parchment. Disputes were settled locally, compensation restored balance, and authority remained negotiable. What empire had centralized, communities redistributed. Economically, circulation shrank but did not cease. Long-distance trade waned as imperial markets collapsed, yet local exchange persisted. Craft adapted to reduced scale. Objects were repaired rather than replaced. Wealth expressed itself through land access, livestock, and followers rather than coin. The emphasis returned to resilience over growth. Religion provided continuity through change. Christianity spread across former Celtic lands in forms that fit local rhythms. It did not erase sacred geography, it repurposed it. Springs became holy wells, groves became churchyards, festivals aligned with ancient seasons. Saints inherited attributes once given to local gods. The old language of place endured beneath new theology. Monasteries emerged as new centres of learning and stability, especially along the Atlantic fringe. They preserved writing without extinguishing oral tradition. Law tracts recorded custom without freezing it entirely. Stories shaped by centuries of speech found new life on vellum. This was not a clean break from the past, but a translation. Memory rendered visible. Language marked survival most clearly. In regions where Roman administration had been strongest, Latin reshaped speech. Elsewhere, older tongues endured. Place names anchored identity to landscape, preserving memory long after political borders vanished. Even where languages changed, cadence and story patterns carried forward. Identity narrowed but intensified. Without large public structures, culture lived in households, kin groups, and local ritual. What had once been widespread became concentrated. This concentration protected meaning. Practices that survived did so because they were essential, useful, resonant, adaptable. The idea of decline obscures this process. It suggests disappearance where there was transformation. Celtic society lost autonomy, scale, and visibility, but it retained its logic. Flexibility over permanence, relationship over rule, memory over monument. These instincts allowed communities to survive multiple collapses, Roman and otherwise. Absorption into larger systems did not end Celtic identity, it layered it. Fragmentation did not destroy coherence, it redistributed it. Survival did not mean stasis, it meant change without surrender. By the early medieval period, what remained was not the old world unchanged, but a living inheritance, reshaped by conquest, preserved by adaptation, and carried forward by people who understood how to live when structures fall away. The Celts did not vanish into history. History passed over them, and they endured beneath it. Collapse ended empires. Absorption altered societies. Survival belonged to those who remembered how to adapt. In that sense, the Celtic story did not conclude with Rome's departure. It continued, quieter, smaller, and more rooted, ready to surface again whenever the world demanded resilience more than power. The Celts who never disappeared. The Celts did not vanish. They did not collapse into silence, nor were they erased by conquest, conversion, or time. What disappeared were their empires, because they never truly built them. What endured was something quieter and far more resilient. Ways of speaking, remembering, believing, and belonging that adapted as the world around them changed. To understand the Celts who never disappeared, one must look not for borders or crowns, but for continuities, threads woven through language, myth, landscape, and identity that survived by becoming ordinary. Legacy began with language. While Latin spread across former Roman provinces, it never fully replaced older tongues everywhere. In regions at the edge, Western Britain, Ireland, Brittany, and parts of Iberia, Celtic languages endured. They shifted, fragmented, and evolved, but they did not die. Speech carried memory when monuments failed. Place names preserved stories of land long after. Political authority faded. Rivers, hills, and settlements retained ancient names that resisted standardization, anchoring identity to geography. Language mattered because it shaped thought. Even where people became bilingual, older rhythms persisted. Storytelling followed familiar patterns. Law retained customary logic. Humour, metaphor, and myth carried forward ways of seeing the world that empire could not regulate. Language kept alive a relationship with place that no administration could fully rewrite. Myth followed a similar path. Celtic myths were never fixed texts. They lived in performance, told, retold, reshaped to fit new moments. When writing arrived, it did not freeze these stories. It captured them mid-flow. Medieval manuscripts from Ireland and Britain preserved tales that reached back into pre-Christian worlds, populated by heroes, otherworldly beings, and landscapes alive with meaning. These stories survived because they adapted, absorbing new beliefs without losing old cores. Christianity did not erase myth, it transformed it. Gods became heroes, sacred places became holy sites. The other world became heaven, hell, or fairy realm, but it remained close. Saints inherited attributes of older deities. Festivals aligned with ancient seasonal rhythms. What changed was interpretation, not presence. Myth survived because it was flexible enough to wear new language. Landscape anchored this continuity. Celtic identity was always tied to land, not abstract territory, but specific places. Springs, hills, islands, and boundaries carried memory. Even after temples fell and towns emptied, these places remained. Pilgrimage replaced offering. Story replaced ritual. Meaning endured because it was embedded in geography. To walk the land was to encounter the past. This intimacy with place-shaped law and custom long after political systems shifted. Customary law persisted in rural communities, guided by precedent and mediation rather than decree. Justice aimed at restoring balance, not asserting authority. These principles resurfaced repeatedly whenever centralized systems weakened, proving their durability. Art preserved continuity visually. Celtic artistic traditions never depended on monumental architecture. They thrived in portable forms: metalwork, carving, manuscript illumination, later textiles and stone crosses. Patterns emphasized movement, interlace, and transformation, reflecting an understanding of life as fluid rather than fixed. These motifs travelled across centuries, reappearing in new contexts without losing meaning. Music and oral tradition carried identity further. Songs preserved history, grief, resistance, and belonging. Music crossed borders more easily than armies, surviving where writing did not. Even today, melodies trace paths older than nations, carrying emotional memory beyond language itself. Modern identity grew from these survivals. In periods of political revival and cultural rediscovery, people looked backward, not to rebuild ancient societies, but to reconnect with enduring values, community, resilience, and belonging to place. Celtic identity became a way of expressing difference without empire, heritage without domination. It was reclaimed not as nostalgia, but as continuity. This identity was never uniform. It differed by region, language, and history, yet it shared a common refusal to disappear quietly. It adapted to modernity as it had adapted to Rome, by absorbing selectively and preserving meaning beneath change. What survived was not a frozen past, but a living inheritance. That living inheritance moved into the modern world not as a relic, but as a vocabulary for belonging. As empires receded and nations formed, Celtic identity resurfaced in moments of pressure, sometimes romanticised, sometimes politicised, often misunderstood. Yet beneath revival movements and modern labels, older patterns endured: attachment to place, respect for memory, and a preference for continuity. Over conquest. In the 19th century, waves of cultural revival swept across Celtic regions. Scholars, poets, and musicians turned to language, folklore, and song not to recreate an ancient society, but to resist erasure. Manuscripts were translated, oral tales were recorded, music was collected and performed publicly. This was not a return to the Iron Age, it was an assertion that identity could survive modernity without surrendering to uniformity. Language became a focal point, where daily use had narrowed, teaching and preservation expanded. Speech carried more than words, it carried ways of thinking shaped by landscape and relationship. Even where fluency declined, cadence, metaphor, and place names kept older sensibilities alive. Language movements did not always succeed in restoring widespread use, but they succeeded in restoring value. Speaking the old tongue became an act of continuity. Myth continued to adapt. Ancient stories found new forms in literature, art, and later, film and music. Heroes and otherworldly journeys became metaphors for displacement, resistance, and return. Myth proved durable because it never demanded literal belief. It offered meaning. It explained loss and endurance. In modern contexts, it provided a shared emotional grammar across generations. Diaspora carried Celtic identity far beyond its homelands. Migration scattered people across continents, but memory travelled with them. Songs, stories, and seasonal rituals recreated belonging in unfamiliar places. Identity became portable, just as it had been in earlier centuries of movement. Community formed through shared practice rather than territory alone. Music played a central role here. Melodies crossed oceans more easily than monuments. Instruments changed, styles evolved, but emotional memory endured. Music became a bridge between past and present, home and away. It did what Celtic culture had always done best. It connected without controlling. Modern Celtic identity is therefore not a single thing. It is layered, regional, and often contested. It can be political, cultural, linguistic, or personal. What unites these expressions is not uniform belief, but a shared emphasis on continuity, on being shaped by what came before without being trapped by it. Importantly, this identity does not seek empire. It does not aim to restore ancient power structures or borders. It values community over dominance, memory over monument. Where it engages politics, it does so to protect language, land, and local autonomy rather than to impose authority outward. This stance echoes deep history. The Celts never disappeared because they never depended on centralised power to define themselves. They did not require permanence to endure. Their identity lived in relationships, in families, stories, landscapes, and shared practices that could survive change by becoming ordinary. Even today, Sacred landscapes retain meaning. Wells, hills, coastlines, and boundary places continue to draw people seeking connection rather than spectacle. Festivals follow ancient rhythms. Law and governance in some regions emphasize mediation and community. These are not reenactments, they are continuities shaped to fit the present. The enduring appeal of Celtic identity lies in its refusal to be fixed. It allows for adaptation without amnesia. It accepts layering, old beneath new, local within global. It understands that survival does not require domination, only memory strong enough to travel. In this sense, the Celts who never disappeared are not only those who speak an ancient language or live in a particular region. They are those who inherit a way of seeing the world that values balance, place, and story. They are present wherever identity is carried forward through practice rather than imposed through power. Empires end, systems collapse, names change. What remains is what can adapt without losing itself. The Celts never disappeared because they learned early how to live that way, quietly, resiliently, and in relationship with land and memory. And as long as those relationships continue to be renewed, the Celtic world remains not behind us, but alongside us, moving forward in forms as old as story and as current as the present moment. The Celts did not build an empire meant to last forever, but they shaped ways of living that endured long after empires fell. Through language, story, land, and memory, their world adapted rather than disappeared. Thank you for watching. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now.